The first thing you notice about that much snow is the quiet. It's a heavy quiet, a quiet that swallows sound whole, like a snake swallowing a rabbit. The wind doesn't howl, it just presses. The crunch of my horse's hooves was the only sound in the entire world, a lonely drum beat in an empty church. I was Colt Avery, and I was riding from nothing, toward nowhere. A man like me doesn't have destinations. We just have directions. Away, always away. Away from the war, from the smoke, from the ghosts that wore familiar faces. My only companions were a horse that had seen better days, a pistol I hadn't fired in 2 years, and a silence in my soul so deep it had its own weather. And then I saw it, a smudge against the gray sky, a little curl of smoke, thin and black, like a dying man's last breath. Smoke means fire, and fire out here in the dead of winter is never a good sign. It's a signal, a warning, a tombstone. My gut twisted into a cold knot. The horse felt it too, its ears twitching, its steps getting choppy. Something was wrong, deeply, fundamentally wrong. I nudged him over the next rise, and the world fell away into a scene straight from hell. A wagon, or what was left of it, lay splintered and blackened in a hollow. Its canvas roof was gone, burned away to skeletal ribs. The snow around it was melted in a sickening, dark circle. The air tasted of burnt wood, burnt cloth, and something else. Something coppery and sweet that turned my stomach. Buzzards were circling overhead. Slow, patient. They always are. I swung down from my horse, my boots sinking into the crusted snow. My rifle felt heavy on my back. Whatever happened here was over. The verdict had already been delivered, the sentence carried out. I started walking toward the wreckage, my eyes scanning for any sign of life, knowing deep down there wouldn't be any. I was just bearing witness to another tragedy in a world full of them. And that's when I heard it. A cry. So faint I thought the wind was playing tricks on me. A thin, reedy sound, like a kitten mewling. I froze, every muscle in my body going rigid. My heart hammered against my ribs. I held my breath, listening. There it was again. Closer this time, stronger. It was human. It was a baby. I scrambled over a charred barrel, my boots slipping on the icy ground. And there, half buried under a scorched blanket, was a woman. Her face was smudged with soot, her hair matted with snow and something dark. But her eyes were open, just barely, and curled on her chest, wrapped in the tattered remains of a coat, was the source of the sound. A baby, no more than a few months old, squirming and crying, fighting against the cold, against the silence, against the death that surrounded him. The woman's eyes found mine. They were dark, bottomless pits of pain. She didn't speak. She didn't move. She just blinked once, a slow, final kind of blink, a transfer of responsibility. Her arms were curled protectively around the child, a last act of defiance. I knelt in the snow, the cold seeping through my pants. Easy now, I whispered, my voice rough from disuse. I've got you. I've got you both. I reached out, my hands clumsy and shaking, and gently peeled back the layers of burnt cloth. The baby's face was red and raw from the cold, but his eyes were wide and alert. He looked right at me, and in that moment, the crying stopped. His tiny mouth impossibly curved into a smile, a pure, uncomplicated smile that didn't belong in a place like this. A smile that cracked something open inside my chest, something I thought had frozen solid years ago. It was a smile that changed everything. I worked fast, my hands moving with a purpose I hadn't felt since the war. The woman was fading, her breath coming in shallow little puffs. I saw the marks then, dark, ugly bruises on her jaw, raw, red rings around her wrists, rope burns. My blood ran cold. This wasn't a random accident. The wagon hadn't just caught fire. It was set, deliberately, and she hadn't just been in it. She had been tied up inside it. This wasn't a tragedy. It was an execution, and she somehow had survived. I built a small fire, feeding it scraps of dry wood from my saddlebag. I wrapped the baby in my own bedroll, the warmest thing I had, and tucked him inside my coat. He snuggled against my chest, his little hand grabbing a fistful of my shirt, anchoring himself to the only warmth in this frozen hellscape. I tended to the woman as best I could. I gave her water from my canteen, a few drops at a time. I covered her with my saddle blanket. She didn't speak. She didn't even moan. She just lay there, her eyes fixed on the fire, her body a testament to a cruelty I couldn't yet comprehend. Night fell like a dropped curtain, black and absolute. The stars came out, cold and distant, like chips of ice scattered across velvet. I didn't sleep. I sat by the fire, the baby sleeping in my arms, the woman breathing shallowly beside me. The silence returned, but it was different now. It was filled with unanswered questions. Who was she? Who was this child? And who would do something like this? Who would burn a woman and a baby alive in the middle of nowhere and leave them for the buzzards? The answer, I knew, wouldn't be a good one. By morning, the woman's fever had broken, but her silence remained. She was weak, but she was alive. The baby woke up and started fussing, and I handed him to her. She took him without a word, her arms closing around him with a desperate strength. It was the first real movement I'd seen her make. It was enough. We rode double on my horse, a slow, grim procession away from the ashes. I wrapped them both in every blanket I had, a strange, mismatched bundle of humanity against the endless white. We were a sorry sight. Me, a ghost of a man. Her, a ghost of a woman and a baby who had no business being alive. By dusk, we saw the smoke of chimneys, a town huddled in a crook of the mountains like a beggar seeking shelter. Black Hollow. The name itself felt like a bad omen. The moment we rode into the main street, the town went quiet. Faces appeared in windows. Men stopped in the street. Their eyes weren't friendly. They were hard, suspicious, and cold. They saw what I saw, not survivors, but trouble. A drifter, a broken woman, and a baby. We were a question nobody wanted to answer. I ignored the stares and headed for the only place that looked remotely welcoming, the general store. A little bell chimed as I pushed the door open. An old woman with hair like spun silver and eyes like chips of flint looked up from behind the counter. Her name was May. I didn't know it then, but this woman was the unofficial gatekeeper of Black Hollow, and her judgment could be harsher than any winter storm. Well, she said, her voice dry as dust, look what the wind blew in. You're dragging a whole lot of shadows with you, mister. Need food, I said, my voice flat. Blankets. Milk if you have it. Her eyes flickered from me to the woman, who stood silently by the door, clutching the baby to her chest. Who's she? Doesn't say. May squinted, her gaze lingering on the woman's bruised face, her vacant eyes. She ain't right in the head, that one. Looks hollowed out. She wasn't wrong, but the way she said it, like a diagnosis and a death sentence all in one, made my hackles rise. I paid for the supplies with the last of my coin, my hands moving stiffly. I could feel the weight of every eye in the town on my back. As we stepped outside, a man blocked our path. He was big, with a barrel chest and a shiny tin star pinned to his coat. Sheriff Holloway. He had the self-satisfied look of a man who enjoyed his authority a little too much. That your kin, Drifter? He asked, his voice a low rumble. She's with me, I said. She got a name. She'll speak when she's ready. The sheriff sniffed, a dismissive, arrogant sound. See that you don't cause any trouble. Black Hollow is a peaceable town. We like to keep it that way. His eyes were like two polished stones, hard and unreadable. But there was something else there too. Something I couldn't quite place. A flicker of recognition. It was gone as quickly as it came. He was just another small-town lawman protecting his patch of dirt. Or so I thought. I found a shelter in an abandoned barn behind the chapel. Preacher Josiah, a man who seemed to be made entirely of skin and bone and quiet sorrow, left the door unlocked for us. A silent act of charity in a town that clearly had little to spare. That night, as the wind howled outside, I made beds out of straw and old burlap sacks. The woman, who I had started calling Ruth in my own mind, helped me, her movements slow but steady. She still hadn't said a word, but as she held the baby, she began to hum, a low, sad melody that seemed to come from a place of deep, ancient pain. It was the first sound she'd made other than breathing. In the flickering lantern light, I watched her, and I felt something shift. We weren't just a drifter and a victim anymore. We were something else, something fragile and new, being built in the ruins of our past lives. Later, after she and the baby had fallen asleep, I sat by the door, my rifle across my lap, watching the snowfall. I thought about Sheriff Holloway's eyes, that flicker of recognition. It bothered me. It was a loose thread, and I knew from experience that loose threads have a way of unraveling everything. I pushed the thought away. We were safe for now. That's what I told myself. But deep down, a new kind of cold was settling in my bones. The cold of suspicion. The cold of knowing that the fire was just the beginning. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small folded piece of paper I'd found tucked into the baby's wrappings. I'd almost missed it in the chaos. It was a page torn from a ledger, filled with neat, spidery handwriting. Most of it was just numbers and dates, but at the bottom, one phrase was circled. Black Hollow. And next to it, a single name. Holloway. My blood turned to ice. It wasn't just recognition I'd seen in the sheriff's eyes. It was guilt. The sheriff didn't just know who she was. He was part of it. The name on the ledger wasn't just a coincidence. It was a breadcrumb, and it led right to the sheriff's door. The whole town felt like a cage, and I just realized the man with the keys was one of the jailers. Holloway wasn't just a suspicious lawman. He was compromised. He was involved. The way he looked at Ruth, that wasn't just suspicion of a stranger. It was the fear of a ghost. A ghost he thought had been laid to rest in a burned-out wagon. My mind raced, trying to piece it together. The fire, the rope burns, the ledger page with his name on it. It pointed to a conspiracy, a dark secret festering right under the surface of this peaceable town. The next few days were a quiet war. I took on odd jobs around Black Hollow, splitting wood, mending fences, anything to earn a few coins and a reason to stay. But my real work was watching. I watched Holloway. I watched how his eyes would follow Ruth whenever she stepped outside the barn. I watched how the townsfolk would lower their voices when he walked by. This wasn't respect, it was fear. Ruth, for her part, was slowly, painstakingly coming back to life. She still didn't speak, but she started to move with purpose. She swept the chapel steps. She mended the baby's clothes with thread she pulled from a burlap sack. She was a woman rebuilding herself one tiny silent act at a time. The baby, who I'd started calling Mason, was the light in our little pocket of darkness. His gurgles and giggles were the only sounds that felt pure in this town rotten with secrets. One morning, Holloway cornered me behind the livery stable. He had two local thugs with him, boys who looked like they'd been mean since birth. "You're starting to overstay your welcome, Avery," Holloway said, trying to sound casual, but his eyes were tight with anxiety. "Folk are getting nervous. A woman with no name, no past." "Her past found her, didn't it, Sheriff?" I said, my voice low and even. I kept my eyes on his, letting him know I knew, or at least that I suspected. His face paled slightly, but he recovered quickly. A flicker of anger crossed his features. "I don't know what you're talking about, but I'm warning you. Take your trouble and move on." "We're not the ones causing trouble here," I said, and let the statement hang in the air. The two thugs shifted their weight, their hands inching toward their belts. I didn't flinch. I let my hand rest on the hilt of the Bowie knife I kept tucked in my belt, a silent promise of violence if they pushed it. Holloway stared at me for a long moment, a battle raging behind his eyes. Then he turned and walked away, his thugs trailing behind him like vultures. He was scared, and a scared man with a badge is the most dangerous animal there is. That night, something new happened. As I sat oiling my pistol, Ruth came and sat beside me. She reached into the folds of her dress and pulled out a small object. It was a wooden figurine, a crudely carved coyote, worn smooth with time and touch. She held it out to me in the palm of her hand. It wasn't a gift, it was a message. I took it, its warmth seeping into my skin. It felt heavy, filled with unspoken meaning. As I turned it over in my fingers, I felt a seam, a tiny, almost invisible line running along its back. My heart skipped a beat. With my thumbnail, I carefully pried it open. It wasn't solid, it was a locket, and nestled inside on a tiny piece of folded paper was another name, Silas Blackwood. The name hit me like a physical blow. Silas Blackwood wasn't just some random person. He was a legend in this part of the country, a mining baron who owned everything for 100 miles in every direction. He owned the land, he owned the mines, he owned the politicians, he owned Black Hollow itself. The town was named after him. He was a phantom, a ghost of immense power who lived in a mansion on the hill, a place the locals called the Perch. No one ever saw him, but everyone felt his presence, and his name was hidden inside a locket held by a woman who was supposed to be dead. The pieces started clicking into place, forming a picture so ugly it made my stomach churn. This wasn't about some backwoods crime. This was bigger, darker. The sheriff wasn't the master of this puppet show. He was just one of the strings, and Silas Blackwood was the one pulling them. I looked at Ruth, her eyes pleading with me to understand, and I did. I finally understood the stakes. We weren't just fighting a corrupt sheriff. We were fighting a king in his own kingdom. The next day I started asking questions. Not directly, of course. That would be a death sentence. I asked about the mines, about how a man gets a job, about the man who owned it all. The answers were always the same. Vague, fearful whispers. You don't talk about Mr. Blackwood. He keeps to himself. Best to just do your work and keep your head down. The entire town was suffocating under the weight of his name. I needed more than whispers. I needed proof. I went to the general store to May. She was hard, yes, but she wasn't cruel, and she saw more than anyone. I bought a pouch of tobacco I didn't need and leaned on the counter. Heard a name, I said, keeping my voice low. Silas Blackwood. Seems to cast a long shadow. May stopped what she was doing. Her face became a blank mask. Some shadows are best left undisturbed, mister. Some shadows hide things that need the light, I replied, holding her gaze. She looked away, her hands nervously wiping down the already spotless counter. You're a fool if you go poking around the Perch. A dead fool. She wouldn't say more, but as I turned to leave, she pressed a small, cold object into my hand. A key. The back room of the chapel, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Midnight. Don't be seen. The hours leading up to midnight were the longest of my life. I sat in the barn, the weight of that key in my pocket, a constant reminder of the danger we were in. Ruth knew something was happening. She watched me with those big, haunted eyes, her silence more expressive than any words. She placed her hand on my arm, a light, questioning touch. I just nodded, a silent promise that I would protect her, that I would find the truth. At midnight, I slipped out of the barn and made my way to the chapel, moving through the shadows like a ghost. The town was asleep, or pretending to be. I unlocked the door to the back room, a small, dusty office filled with old books and parish records. A single lantern was burning on a desk. Preacher Josiah was sitting there, waiting for me. His face was etched with worry. May stood by the window, a shotgun resting in the crook of her arm. She told me you were asking questions, the preacher said, his voice a dry rasp. Questions that can get a man killed. The woman and the child deserve answers, I said. They deserve justice. May turned from the window. Justice is a luxury we can't afford in Black Hollow, Avery. Survival is the best we can hope for. Tell me about Blackwood, I demanded. The preacher sighed, a long, weary sound. He opened a heavy ledger on his desk. It wasn't a parish record. It was a town record, filled with births, deaths, and marriages. He flipped through the pages until he found what he was looking for. He pointed a long, bony finger at an entry. Ruth, he said softly. Her last name was Connolly. She came here 2 years ago, an indentured servant bought by Silas Blackwood to work at his house. My blood ran cold. Indentured servant. A pretty word for a slave. She was beautiful, May added, her voice softening for the first time. Quiet, but strong. Blackwood, he took a liking to her. The ugly truth began to spill out. Silas Blackwood, the powerful, reclusive baron, had a wife. A cold, barren woman named Eleanor, who was as cruel as she was wealthy. When Ruth became pregnant, Eleanor saw it not as a betrayal, but as an insult. An heir that she could never provide. An heir that would inherit the Blackwood fortune. Eleanor runs things now, the preacher explained. Silas has been sick for years, wasting away. She has the power, the money, the control. She hired the men who burned that wagon. She paid Holloway to look the other way, to make sure the story was buried along with the bodies. So that was it. A story as old as time. Greed, jealousy, and murder. Mason wasn't just some random baby. He was Silas Blackwood's son, the sole heir to a fortune that could change the fate of this entire territory. And Eleanor Blackwood would stop at nothing to make sure he never saw a penny of it. She thought they were both dead, May said, her voice grim. When you rode into town with them, you didn't just bring trouble. You brought back the one thing Eleanor Blackwood is afraid of, the truth. A floorboard creaked behind me. I spun around, my hand flying to my pistol. It was Holloway. He wasn't holding a gun. He was holding his hat in his hands, his face a mask of misery and fear. They've got my family, he whispered, his voice cracking. My wife, my daughter. Eleanor has them. She said if I didn't handle you, if I didn't get that boy back for her, she'd send them back to me in pieces. The cage wasn't just around me and Ruth. It was around the entire town. Everyone was a prisoner of the woman on the hill. There's more, Holloway said, his eyes wild with desperation. One of the men who burned the wagon, he's back. He rode into town an hour ago. Eleanor sent him to finish the job, and she gave him a present. He looked at me, his face ashen. She gave him a deputy's badge. The new deputy was a man named Barlow, a thick, broad-shouldered brute with a scar that snaked down his neck and disappeared into his collar. I'd seen his type before in the war. Men who enjoyed the breaking of things. Men for whom cruelty was a language they spoke fluently. His presence in town was like a lit fuse on a powder keg. He didn't even try to hide who he was. He walked the street with a swagger, his hand always resting on the butt of his pistol, his eyes scanning every face with open contempt. He was Eleanor Blackwood's dog, and he was off the leash. The plan became brutally simple. We couldn't fight our way out. Blackwood's mansion was a fortress, and he had an army of hired guns. We couldn't run. Barlow and Holloway would hunt us down. Our only hope was to expose Eleanor, to bring the truth into the light so brightly that even the shadows she commanded couldn't extinguish it. And for that, we needed irrefutable proof, something more than our word against hers. The locket, I said, turning to Ruth, who had been brought to the chapel under the cover of darkness. The coyote. What does it mean? For the first time since I'd met her, she spoke. Her voice was a dry, rasping whisper, as if the words themselves were painful. My father carved it for me, she said, her eyes welling with tears. He told me it would keep me safe. Is there anything else, Ruth? Preacher Josiah asked gently. Anything you took from the house? She shook her head, her face etched with despair. Nothing. I ran with nothing but the clothes on my back and my son. We were at a dead end. We had the story, but no proof to back it up. Eleanor could deny everything, paint Ruth as a crazed, lying servant, and have us all hang before sunset. The air in the small room was thick with hopelessness. We were trapped. Then Mason, who had been sleeping in Ruth's arms, began to stir. He fussed, and a small object fell from the folds of his blanket and clattered onto the wooden floor. It was another wooden toy, a tiny, intricately carved bird. My eyes narrowed. I picked it up. It was carved from the same dark wood as the coyote, by the same hand. But this one felt different. It was heavier. I twisted the base of the bird. A low click echoed in the silent room. The bottom came off, revealing a small, hollow compartment. And inside, wrapped around a tiny scroll of paper, was a ring. It wasn't a fancy ring. It was a simple gold band, but engraved on the inside were two names, Silas and Ruth, and a date. And beneath it, a single damning word, married. The room fell silent. Even the lantern seemed to hold its breath. He married me, Ruth whispered, her voice filled with awe and disbelief. A month before Mason was born. It was in secret. Just him, me, and a traveling judge. He was so afraid of Eleanor. He said this was the only way to protect me, to make sure Mason was seen as his legitimate son. This changed everything. Mason wasn't just a bastard heir. He was the legal heir. Ruth wasn't an indentured servant. She was Ruth Blackwood, the rightful mistress of the perch. The paper scroll was a certified copy of the marriage license, signed and sealed by a judge from Dry Bend. Eleanor hadn't just tried to murder a servant and her child. She had tried to murder her husband's wife and his legitimate son. This was the proof we needed. This was the weapon that could bring her down. She can't know about this, Holloway stammered, his eyes wide with terror. If she finds out this exists, she'll burn the whole town to the ground to get it. Then we need to get it out of town, I said, my mind racing. We need to get it to the territorial marshal in Dry Bend. Dry Bend is 2 days' ride, May said grimly, and you can bet Eleanor has watchers on every road out of Black Hollow. Then I won't take the road, I said. I looked at the preacher. Is there another way? Through the mountains? He nodded slowly. There's an old mining trail. It's dangerous, treacherous, but it bypasses the main roads. It'll take you straight to the other side of the ridge. From there, it's a clear shot to Dry Bend. The plan was set. I would take the marriage license and make a run for Dry Bend. Holloway would use his authority as sheriff to create a diversion, to draw Barlow and the other Blackwood guns into a wild goose chase. May and the preacher would hide Ruth and Mason in a secret cellar beneath the chapel. It was a desperate, long-shot plan. 100 things could go wrong, but it was the only plan we had. As dawn approached, we prepared to move. I tucked the precious scroll and the ring into a leather pouch and secured it inside my shirt. Ruth came to me, her eyes shining with a mixture of fear and a fierce, newfound hope. "Be careful, Colt," she whispered, her hand resting on my chest. It was the first time she had used my name. I just nodded, my throat too tight for words. I turned to leave, but she stopped me. "He needs a protector," she said, looking down at the sleeping Mason. "A father." The words hung in the air between us, a promise of a future that was still so uncertain. I slipped out of the chapel and made my way to the stables, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I saddled my horse, the familiar creak of leather, a small comfort in the crushing tension. The town was still shrouded in the pre-dawn gloom, quiet and still. Too quiet. My instincts screamed at me. Something was wrong. I swung into the saddle and urged my horse into a slow walk, sticking to the shadows of the alleyways. As I neared the edge of town, where the mountain trail began, I saw him. Barlow. He was waiting for me. He wasn't alone. He had 6 men with him, all armed, all looking like they were ready for a war. Someone had talked. The plan had been leaked. We had a traitor in our midst, Holloway. It had to be him. His fear had finally won. He'd sold us out to save his own family. Barlow smiled, a slow, cruel stretching of his lips that didn't reach his eyes. "Going somewhere, Avery?" he drawled, his voice dripping with mock politeness. "The lady on the hill would like a word with you, and she's very particular about her property." His eyes flickered down to my chest, and I knew. He knew exactly what I was carrying. It was a trap, and I had walked right into it. My mind raced. There was no way to fight my way through them. They had me outnumbered, outgunned. Running was suicide. For a split second I considered it. Dying on my feet was better than dying on my knees. But then I thought of Ruth and Mason, hiding in the dark, waiting for a hope that would never come if I failed. I couldn't fail. "Looks like you've got me," I said, slowly raising my hands. It was a gamble, a desperate play for time. I needed a diversion, an opportunity, a miracle. Barlow's grin widened. "Wise choice. Now hand it over, nice and slow." As his men moved to surround me, a sudden piercing sound split the morning air. The church bell. It was ringing frantically, a wild, chaotic alarm that shattered the morning quiet. It wasn't the slow, mournful toll for Sunday service. It was a call to arms. Barlow and his men froze, their heads snapping toward the chapel. What the hell was that? And then all hell broke loose. A window on the second floor of the general store shattered, and the crack of a rifle echoed through the street. One of Barlow's men cried out and crumpled to the ground. It was May. She was perched in the window like a hawk, her old hunting rifle smoking in her hands. That was the signal. Suddenly, doors flew open all along the main street. The miners, the blacksmith, the stable hands, men who had been crushed under Blackwood's thumb for years, poured out into the street. They weren't armed with guns. They were armed with pickaxes, hammers, and a lifetime of pent-up rage. It wasn't Holloway who had betrayed us. It was the preacher, but he hadn't sold us out. He had rallied the town. He had given them a choice: die on your knees or fight on your feet. And they had chosen to fight. Barlow was stunned, his face a mask of disbelief. He had expected a quiet capture, not a full-blown rebellion. "Kill them!" he roared at his men. "Kill them all!" But his men hesitated, their confidence shaken by the sudden, furious uprising. This was my chance. I dug my heels into my horse's flanks, and he leaped forward straight at Barlow. He was so focused on the chaos in the street that he didn't see me coming until it was too late. I leaned low and slammed my shoulder into his chest, sending him sprawling into the dirt. I didn't stop. I galloped past the stunned gunman and onto the mountain trail, the sounds of the battle raging behind me. The trail was even worse than the preacher had described. It was a narrow, winding path that clung to the side of the mountain, with a sheer drop on one side and a wall of rock on the other. My horse scrambled for footing on the loose scree, his breath coming in ragged bursts. I pushed him on, my mind a whirlwind of fear and adrenaline. I could hear shouting behind me, the occasional crack of a pistol. They were coming after me. I risked a glance over my shoulder. Two of Barlow's men were on the trail behind me, gaining fast. They were on lighter, faster horses. They would catch me before I reached the summit. I had to do something. I couldn't let them get the license. I pulled the leather pouch from my shirt. My mind flashed back to Ruth, to her hand on my chest, her voice saying my name. I thought of the locket her father had carved, the coyote, a symbol of a clever survivor. An idea, insane and desperate, sparked in my mind. Ahead, the trail curved sharply around a rocky outcrop. It was my only chance. As I rounded the bend, out of sight of my pursuers, I reined in my horse so hard he reared up. I leaped from the saddle, holding the precious pouch in one hand and my bowie knife in the other. I scrambled up the rock face beside the trail, my fingers finding purchase in the narrow cracks. I flattened myself against the cold stone, my heart hammering against my ribs. A few seconds later, the two riders galloped around the bend. They saw my horse, riderless, and pulled up in confusion. That's when I dropped. I landed on the back of the first rider, my knife finding the soft spot under his arm. He screamed, a high, thin sound that was cut short as we both tumbled from the saddle. I hit the ground hard, the air knocked from my lungs. The second rider, his face a mask of shock, fumbled for his pistol. I didn't give him the chance. I rolled, came up with my own gun, and fired. The shot echoed through the mountains, a sharp, final crack. Silence. I lay there for a moment, gasping for breath, the metallic taste of blood and fear in my mouth. I had the pouch. It was safe. But my horse was gone, spooked by the gunshot, and I was miles from anywhere, on foot, with a town at war behind me and a long road ahead. I got to my feet, my body screaming in protest. I had to keep moving. I started the long, grueling trek toward Dry Bend, every step a painful reminder of how much was at stake. The journey was a nightmare. I stumbled through the mountains, my body battered and bruised, my mind haunted by the sounds of the battle I'd left behind. Was Ruth safe? Was Mason? Had the town's desperate courage been enough? Or had I just led them all to their deaths? I had no way of knowing. All I could do was put one foot in front of the other, fueled by a desperate hope in the image of Ruth's face. 2 days later, I staggered into Dry Bend. I must have looked like a wild man, my clothes torn, my face covered in dirt and dried blood. But I didn't care. I found the marshal's office and collapsed through the door, pushing the leather pouch across the desk before the world went black. When I woke up, I was in a clean bed. A doctor was standing over me, and the territorial marshal, a man with a weathered face and kind eyes, was sitting in a chair by the window. "You've caused quite a stir, Mr. Avery," the marshal said, a small smile playing on his lips. "When we read that marriage license, we sent a whole company of rangers to Black Hollow. They arrived this morning." My heart stopped. What did they find? "They found a town under siege," he said, his voice turning grim. "Barlow and his men had holed up in the saloon. The townsfolk, led by a very brave preacher and a woman who can shoot the wings off a fly at 100 yards, had them pinned down. It was a standoff. My men ended it quickly." He paused, letting the words sink in. "They also paid a visit to the perch, arrested a Mrs. Eleanor Blackwood for conspiracy to commit murder. Seems her husband, Silas, was more than willing to testify against her. He'd been a prisoner in his own home for years, too sick and afraid to stand up to her, until now. Relief washed over me, so powerful it almost made me pass out again. They were safe. They had won. "What about Barlow?" I asked. "Resisted arrest," the marshal said simply, a clear euphemism for the justice he deserved. "The rest of his men are in custody. Sheriff Holloway is being hailed as a hero. He claims he was working undercover the whole time, gathering evidence against the Blackwoods." The marshal winked. "We're inclined to believe him. A man needs a second chance." A few days later, after I had recovered my strength, the marshal gave me a fresh horse and a new coat. "Black Hollow is a different place now, Avery," he said as he shook my hand. "Silas Blackwood passed away peacefully 2 days ago. In his final will, he left everything, the mines, the town, the entire fortune, to his son, Mason. He named 2 legal guardians to manage the estate until the boy comes of age. He handed me a thick envelope. He named you and his wife, Ruth." The ride back to Black Hollow was different. The air felt cleaner, the sun brighter. The heavy blanket of fear that had smothered the town was gone. When I rode down the main street, people didn't stare with suspicion. They smiled. They waved. They called out my name. It was a strange feeling, being a hero, a feeling I wasn't sure I deserved. I found them at the small cabin on the eastern ridge, the one Preacher Josiah had given them. Smoke was curling from the chimney, a welcoming plume against the blue sky. Ruth was on the porch, rocking a sleeping Mason in her arms. She looked up as I approached, and a smile bloomed on her face. A real, genuine smile, so bright it could have melted the last of the winter snow. I swung down from my horse and walked up the steps. I didn't say anything. I didn't need to. I just stood there looking at them, my family. "I knew you'd come back," she whispered. "I'll always come back," I said, my voice thick with emotion. She stood up and placed Mason in my arms. He was heavier than I remembered. He stirred in his sleep, his little hand reaching up to touch my face. I looked from his face to hers, and in that moment, I knew I was finally home. The drifter was done drifting. The silence in my soul was finally filled, not with the ghosts of the past, but with the promise of a future. A future I never knew I wanted, but now couldn't imagine living without. We had faced down monsters and stared into the abyss, and we had come out the other side, not broken, but stronger. Forged in fire and bound by a love that was tougher than any mountain and more precious than any fortune. The past will always leave scars, but some scars are just a reminder of the battles you've won. And we had won the most important battle of all. If you believe that courage can change the world and that family is something you build, not something you're born into, then do us a favor. Hit that like button and don't forget to subscribe, because everyone deserves a story of hope, and we've got plenty more to share.